In this video, we're going to look at an example of a process similar to your lab assignment for this week. We'll be loading data from a Kaggle dataset into Google Sheets, in this case a collection of Netflix original films and their corresponding scores in the Internet Movie Database. We'll be loading this into our spreadsheet, creating some pivot tables, and from those corresponding charts and graphs. This dataset can be downloaded from Kaggle as a comma-separated value sheet. It's plain text with no formatting. I've already done this, and I've got that CSV ready to load. So what I'll do in my spreadsheet is File, Import, click on the Upload section, and I'll drag my CSV from my local File Explorer. We'll load it into a sheet, again automatically attempting to detect the data types for each of the corresponding columns. Click on Import Data, and there's a link above here that says File imported successfully, open now. When I click on this, it will open it up in a new sheet with no formatting, no header. I'm going to create my header as I like to do. A little bit of fill, centering, and I'm going to freeze it in place so that, again, I can scroll down through the data and still have my header in place. As before, what we want to do is clean up the data, look for any potential outlying records, any mistakes that need to be fixed. Also, while we're at it, I'm going to change this column C, which is a date format, into something that's a little more easy to read. Format, number, and there's an option for date. Now, fun fact, if you highlight more than one column, and if you put your mouse pointer on the vertical bar in between any two columns and do a double click, all the selected columns will now be auto-sized to the width of their maximum values. That makes things look nice and pretty. Now, as you can see here, we've got columns for title, genre, the premiere date, the running time in minutes, and a corresponding Internet Movie Database score for each show, along with its language. In order to try and identify any misconfigured records, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort this. Sort range first by genre, just so that I can take a look at the different values of genre, see if they are spelled consistently, see if there are any values that don't seem to fit correctly. And what I'm finding is that the genres, while there's a wealth of different genre combinations, I don't see an inconsistent format. These seem to be entered pretty well, so I'm not going to worry about cleaning up genres. Let me change my sort to language and look at the different values in language to see if there's anything I need to clean up here. And what I'm finding in column F is that the values, when sorted, seem to be entered pretty consistently with no misspellings or anything like that that I can see. So those values I'm going to assume are probably okay. This is a little bit of high-level due diligence kind of checking, right? So now I'll sort them by title in ascending order. What I find is that at the very top I get some questionable values because the non-alphanumeric characters sort to the top here. I guess the numeric characters do. Hashtag reality high is probably a legitimate value. We don't normally see pound signs in the titles of things, but that's an internet thing, right? The hashtags. 1922, could that possibly be a correct title for a film in the horror crime drama? Well, you know, with just a little bit of cursory searching, I found that in fact it is. Yeah, it's a movie that takes place apparently in the year 1922 with James Woods. So yeah, that title appears to be legitimate. The remaining two here, 22 July, which is, if you look here, that's just the way it seems to be coming up in the formatting, is actually a date value. And likewise, this one is also a date value in the title column. Those values are questionable. I don't know if they're legit or not. There's probably an actual title corresponding to these, but if I'm not certain, and if I think it might throw off my results, what I can do is remove these two rows. I'm just going to right-click, delete them, as a little bit of cursory data cleanup. Everything else I see here in these 500 or so rows seems to be formatted well enough. I don't see any values that look like they're erroneous. And the formatting of the scores also appears to be pretty consistent. Only one column after the decimal point. So we can work with this. What we're going to start off doing first is I'm going to take a subset of this data, not all the columns, just a couple of them. I'm going to grab the genre column by clicking the letter B at the top of that column. And I'm also going to grab the runtime column by holding down the Control key and selecting column D as well. Control C will copy these two, and what I'm going to do is add a new sheet and paste my data there. Control V. I get my genre values for each show, along with the corresponding runtime for that show. I'm going to rename this sheet very quickly to subset genre / runtime. So we can see that these columns here are containing just those values. And I can even, if I choose, sort these by genre. Why not? You'll see there's groupings here. The action genre shows up 7 times. Action comedy, 6 times, and so on. And the corresponding runtime for those shows that are in that genre. Now that we have just these two values, that's nice. I'm going to use them to create a pivot table. And in pivot tables, we can use the spreadsheet program to calculate aggregate values for us. And if you've taken SQL classes, which of course you have if you're in here, you know that those aggregate values can be calculated in an SQL environment, in a relational database setting, but we don't have access to that here. These are not in database tables. They're in rows and columns of a spreadsheet. So if we want to see and calculate these aggregates, we need to use something like a pivot table. If I highlight these two columns and go to Data, inside Data is an option for Pivot Table. Microsoft Excel, by the way, has the same functionality in a different place in the menu, but it works the same way. We can create a pivot table from these values. It's going to ask me, do I want this in a new sheet or the existing sheet? I'd like to put it into a new sheet. And I'm going to rename this default name of Pivot Table 1. We're going to call this Pivot Table : genre. What we have here is a little grid that's created for us to populate, where we can drag values into the rows and columns area. So what I'd like to see in my pivot table is one row for every value of genre. So over here, these correspond to the column headers from the previous sheet that I highlighted. Now, I'd like to see one row in my output for every value of genre. So what I can do, in the pivot table editor, under rows, I can drag the genre from this list, that contains the two columns I had in my sheet, over to rows, release it, and now we see automatically a new column here in which the label is genre, and there is one row for each unique value of genre. Instead of 500 rows, we get 116, along with a grand total row at the bottom, which I'll come back to in a moment. We see one row again for each unique value of genre. Now what I would like to see in my columns for each genre, let's say I want to see how many total minutes there are, how many total runtime minutes there are for each of those genres. I could drag runtime into columns, for example, but that's not really what we want to see. What we'd like to see is a calculated aggregate value based on runtime. So under values, which is below columns, I can click Add, and one of the options for things I can add is a calculated field. Now if I drag runtime down into this calculated field, notice it turns green when I'm over top of it. If I release my mouse button, I now have a calculated value based on the runtime value. Default to sum. This is a sum of all the runtimes. Looks good. That's exactly what I wanted. Let's say I'd like to calculate another aggregate, but this time I want to see the average runtime for each of the genres. So once again, I click Add, drag runtime into this calculated field, change that default aggregate calculation from sum into average. The numbers come up calculated to many digits of precision. If I change that format by format number, I'm going to use custom number format, where I'll have a whole host of not just pre-formatted options, but also the ability to configure my format using these format mask options. Click Apply, and now my average of runtime comes up with 2 digits after the decimal place. I'm going to rename these just to make them look a little easier to read. Average runtime. Call this one total runtime. We don't need to beat people over the head with the fact that we're using aggregate functions like sum and average. Total runtime and average runtime for each genre. For action, the total runtime comes up as 756, the average for each record being 108. I think there are, what, 6 or 7 different rows in action, so sounds about right. Now from this, again, we have one row for every unique value of the genre, and there's a running total at the bottom, a grand total. If you remember from the aggregate calculations and group by clause in SQL, there was an option similar to this called with rollup in SQL Server, a rollup giving you a grand total of each of those calculated aggregate values. That's nice, but in this case we don't actually need it, and it's going to get in the way of creating our visualization. I'll show you how that happens. For my first graph, I'm going to select the genre column and the total runtime column, and from this, insert a chart, which defaults to column. I'm going to change that to pie graph. Put that over here. This gives me a nice breakdown of every genre along with its total runtime and how much that compares with other runtimes. But we unfortunately have 50% of the pie chart taken up by the grand total, which is basically each of these added up together. We don't want that in our graph. So what I can do is scroll down here. What I can't do is delete it. If I right-click on this, there's no option to delete it, but I do have an option to hide it, and that will make it squeezed in between row 116 and row 118. It's still there, but it's hidden and it's excluded now from the graph. Now my pie chart shows a breakdown of total runtime minutes, showing that most, well, not the majority of time, but the largest slice of total time on Netflix in that period was shown on documentaries. And if you're familiar with Netflix, not surprised, there's a lot of them on there. There's also a lot of dramas, some comedies, romantic comedies, and so on. And that seems to be pretty intuitive to me. It seems to jive pretty well with my experience watching shows on Netflix. Let's make another chart, this time from the combination of genre and holding down the Control key. By the way, if I hold down the Shift key and click column C, I get column A, B, and C. Column A, column C, and everything in between. But if I don't want the intermediary column, what I do is click on the A to select row A, hold down the Control key to click C, and now I get only those two. From these, I would like to insert a new chart. This one comes up by default as the same type as the previous, another pie graph. And you know I like pie graphs. That's nice, but it's not really appropriate for this visualization. It makes for this really psychedelic looking pie graph, but it doesn't give us a way to interpret the data usefully. I'm going to change this type from pie chart to instead a horizontal bar chart. Now this seems a little more intuitive. For every row in the chart, I have one particular genre, from action down to war drama, and to the right of it I see a horizontal bar that represents the average. Sorry, I need to freeze this top row so we still see our header. The average runtime for that genre. And the ones that have long average runtimes have long bars, and vice versa. The shorter ones show up down here. If we want to visualize this together in a way that all the long-running averages are grouped together, and the short ones likewise, you do not have the option, unfortunately, within the chart to change this order, but you do have the option in the pivot table itself to change the sort order. By default, it's in alphabetical order by column A, but I can change that from the genre column to the average runtime column in ascending or descending order if I choose. You'll notice they change in the source data over here, and that will affect, to a certain extent, the way it looks in the pie chart, even though you're still getting accurate data. But now, in my bar chart, you can clearly see the genres with the long-running average times are all down at the bottom, and the ones with the shorter times, like anime/short, not surprisingly, have a much shorter bar. This gives you a way to, and if I expand this a little bit more, if I had a higher resolution screen, it would be easier to see what each of these are. But this gives you an idea of how to use pivot tables to create aggregate values, and from those to make new charts and graphs that we wouldn't have had the option of doing from the original source data. Let's try one more example. This time I'm going to grab the language column, and I'm going to grab the Internet Movie Database score column. That's columns E and F. Control C to copy these. I'll add a new sheet. Control V to paste. And now I have a new sheet with values for the language and IMDb scores. Let's say I want to change the order of these. I'd like the language to be over here. So I'm going to grab column B, and with the little hand, click, drag to the left. Conveniently, positions are swapped. I could have done select, copy, insert, paste, but we use what's available to us, right? Now, this is very nice. I've got source data here for how many rows? About 500. Again, I'm going to sort these by language, just so we see how they group together. At the very top, whoops, wrong button. At the very top, we have Bengali, and then Dutch, then English, and so on and so on. And for each of these, for each language, the corresponding IMDb score for this show in that language. Once again, to get the aggregate values calculated, I need to create a pivot table. So I'm going to highlight these two columns, Data, Pivot Table, and again put this in a new sheet. Let me rename these sheets that I'm making here. The one with the source data is going to be called Subset Language. And my new pivot table I'm going to call Pivot Table Language. Now, the row I would like to see, the unique values for each row, is going to be the language. And rather than 500 rows, we now have only 40. with a grand total, which I'm going to hide now because I already know the kind of problems that's going to give me. And clicking back in here brings up the pivot table editor once again. And what I would like to see in the column table are a couple of calculated aggregate values. We'll start with the total number of shows in this language. I'm going to add a calculated field. I'm going to drag the IMDb score down into this field. Now, rather than add those scores together, I'm simply going to count them. So what I end up with is, for each language, this calculated value that represents the total number of rows, actual values that correspond to that language in the previous sheet, right? Since they're all populated, none of them are null, then what that amounts to is the total number of rows for that language. I'm going to rename this to simply number of shows. And it happens to be already formatted in integer format, which is perfect for me. Let's do one more calculated aggregate value. Under Values, you click Add, Calculated Field. I'm going to drag the IMDb score in there again until it turns green, and change the default sum aggregation into average, the average IMDb score for each language. And they are coming up correctly calculated, but the formatting is ugly, so I'm going to highlight this column, select Format, Number, Custom, and I think I'll give us one decimal, or one digit after the decimal place, along with the commas. We won't need them in case the IMDb score is 1,000 or more. We'll have those commas there if we need them, but what we end up with is something a lot better, a lot closer to the original source data was one digit of precision, one digit after the decimal place. So our pivot table is now similar. We have a row here of junk data. I'm simply going to hide that to take it out of the picture. Now, time to make some visualizations from our data. Like the previous example, I'll take language and total number of shows. I'll make a pie chart from this one. Bar chart looks good. It's useful information, but I'm going to change this to pi, just so we can see from this visualization the relative values in terms of like percentage-wise. The vast majority of the shows on Netflix appear to have been in English, almost 70%, although there's a fair number in Spanish. And is this Hindi? Quite a good representation of Hindi there, as well as French. Interesting, being able to see these this data with this kind of visualization. Now, let's do one more. Similar to the previous example, I'm going to make a bar chart based on the combination of language and Control-click and average score. Insert chart. It seems to have come up by default with a bar chart, which is great, which is what I wanted anyway. If I needed to change that, I could have done it over here under Chart Type. And again, as with the previous example, if I want to be able to sort my data by the average score, I cannot do it within the chart itself, but I can go back and change the sort order in the pivot table itself. Under the pivot table editor, the rows by default are in ascending by language. If I change that to ascending by average score, once again, my pie chart above gets shifted around, turned into a Pac-Man apparently. But again, the values are correct. The English is still the majority, although the color changed. Not a big deal. But now in my bar chart, I can clearly see that the languages with the lowest average score are sorting to the top, and these include English/Japanese as opposed to actual English. And the ones with the highest average score include English/Ukrainian/Russian for whatever reason. Whether there is an actual correlation in the values in the data remains to be seen. But if I were to try to identify these correlations, here's the way to do it. I can put them in this format, take a look, and see if anything pops out. So, your lab assignment for week 2 is going to involve a very similar Kaggle datasheet I'm going to give to you in comma-separated value format, which you'll be tasked with loading into this spreadsheet program, creating some pivot tables, and from them, some similar charts to these, bar chart and pie, based on these aggregate calculations.